Hello again. In the previous video I was talking about how narrators create suspense and whether they just rely on giving you details of a physical world and withholding certain information to keep you in the dark, or if they sort of inhabit the mind of some of their characters and that allows some crazy things to happen. I'm just going to talk about the two stories this week, and I want to sort of compare and contrast them. And let's start with an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. As I mentioned in the earlier video, I can totally understand that sort of fantasy, right? The guy has been, he's trying to burn down the bridge, but it's a federal scout, he gets caught, so now they've, the Northerners, have decided to hang him. And so maybe from the time that the plank goes down and he's about to be hanged, he creates this elaborate fantasy of him escaping. I get that. But we also have some sort of fantasy or hallucination in the other story. And I wonder if, in an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, it's to the, the fantasy is to the character's benefit, right? Because it's him escaping his death. And I'm trying to think about what's happening in Young Goodman Brown and why that fantasy is happening. And of course, or I don't know if you call it a fantasy, but why that hallucination, or maybe you believe it really happened. I tend to think maybe it didn't happen. But why he has that sort of imagery in his head. And of course we have nightmares, right? Not every dream that you have is a happy dream. It can be a nightmarish dream. And that seems to be like what's happening here. But now that, if we juxtapose this story with the other story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, where it's a much more pleasurable fantasy because he's escaping, I wonder if this isn't so nightmarish. I wonder if, part of that character wants to sort of, indulge in the dark side of his nature, Does that make sense? His name is Young Goodman Brown, right? Good man. I have another video in which we'll talk about symbols. I don't think the symbols are very subtle in this story. Young Good Man Brown. And so I feel like there's all this pressure for him to live up to this ideal. And we think of the wife, her name is Faith, she has these pink ribbons in her hair, she's sort of like the perfect image of a wife, right? And humans are far more complicated than that, right? So I think it's fair to read this, if you believe that the incident in the woods didn't happen, I think it's fair to believe that it's like a nightmare. But I also think it's interesting to wonder if maybe he didn't find some pleasure in that dream, and that, humans are, we're these complicated creatures where you sort of, we all have our secrets or our sort of dark impulses, I guess. I don't know what to call them. But we're complicated creatures. And I think that the more I read this story, the more I find that I think that it's almost like this outlet for the character, and that he's really not as afraid of it as he seems to be. I think he's maybe ashamed of it because he feels like he has to keep up this good man persona. So I think maybe he's ashamed, but I don't think he's really afraid of it in the way that I thought he was the first few times I read the story. And so I just wanted to, sort of air those ideas out to you guys. Maybe we can talk about it in the discussion threads, or you can shoot me an email. Maybe you think I'm totally off base. But I sort of hate stories that reduce the human condition to all good or all bad. And I feel like that's kind of what happens in Young Goodman Brown if you read it in this very simple way where the incident in the woods never happened. It was just a nightmare and he's totally petrified by it. But I think it's a little bit more interesting and maybe realistic where we say, yeah, it didn't happen, and maybe he's ashamed that he had these thoughts, but maybe in a way it's like a purge, right? And by him having these sort of dark hallucinations, he doesn't have to act out on them in real life, but by having the dark hallucinations, it's kind of an outlet for him, so he can go on living the good life in the real world, but he sort of has this, these dark tendencies in his subconscious. So that's just something I wanted to throw out there so you can talk about. You can feel free to call me on it if you think it's a bunch of nonsense. As you can see, I'm just sort of talking off the cuff right now. It's just an idea that sort of came to me as I was rereading the story this week. But you can let me know what you think.